Imagine, just imagine for one moment, the government comes to you. The same government that spent 100 years destroying everything you loved. Your land was taken. Your children were taken. Your ceremonies were banned. Your language, the very words your grandmother taught you as a child, beaten out of you in schools that were built to make you disappear. And then that same government looks you in the eye and says, "We need you. We need your help. We need your language. The language we tried to destroy. We need it now, because we are losing the war." Would you say yes? Think about that seriously. Would you say yes? These men said yes, and because they did, the course of World War II changed forever. Millions of lives were saved. America came home to victory parades and celebrations and freedom, and the men who made that victory possible came home to silence. No parades, no medals, no recognition. They were ordered to say nothing, to tell no one, for 23 years. Not their wives, not their parents, not their children. What they did in that war was classified top secret. And most of them carried that secret quietly, without complaint, without bitterness, for the rest of their lives. This is the story of the Native American Code Talkers, the most important secret in American military history, and one of the most profound examples of dignity and service and quiet heroism that this country has ever witnessed, or failed to properly acknowledge. Before we talk about the war, before we talk about the codes and the battles and the medals, we need to understand who these men were and what had already been done to their people. You cannot fully understand what it meant for these men to serve without understanding what their people had already survived. The Navajo people, who call themselves the Diné, meaning simply the people, have lived across the American Southwest for thousands of years. Red rock canyons, towering sandstone mesas, skies that stretch unbroken to every horizon. Within this landscape, the Navajo developed a civilization of remarkable depth. Their weaving traditions produced textiles of extraordinary intricacy. Their ceremonial practices wove together every aspect of daily existence into a worldview where nothing existed in isolation, where every element of the natural and human world was understood to be in relationship with every other element. And at the center of all of it was the language, a language that linguists who have spent careers studying the world's languages still describe as one of the most structurally complex communication systems ever developed by any human culture anywhere on Earth. It had no alphabet, no written form of any kind. This was not a limitation. It was simply unnecessary, because the oral tradition that carried it was strong enough and precise enough to transmit knowledge across generations with complete fidelity. Stories told by elders to children were told with the same words and rhythms that had been used centuries before. Prayers were transmitted with exact phonetic precision. The language was alive and intact and constantly in use. Spoken, sung, prayed, for thousands of years without the need for any written support system. For a people with this relationship to their language, what was about to happen in the 19th century was not merely a practical disruption. It was an assault on something sacred. In the spring and summer of 1864, United States military forces conducted a campaign across Navajo territory, resulting in the forced removal of virtually the entire Navajo population from their homeland. Soldiers burned hogans, destroyed food stores, killed livestock, making it impossible for families to remain on the land. What followed became known as the Long Walk. Thousands of men, women, children, and elders were forced to march hundreds of miles to a desolate reservation called Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. The pace was often faster than the elderly or very young could maintain. Food was inadequate. Winter conditions claimed lives. Those who could not keep pace were left behind. At Bosque Redondo, conditions were, if anything, worse. Crowded into insufficient space, dependent on inadequate government rations in a climate completely unlike their homeland, the Navajo spent 4 years in what was effectively imprisonment. Disease spread. Crops failed repeatedly. By the time a treaty allowed their return in 1868 to a reduced portion of their original territory, an entire chapter of suffering had been added to the long history of this people. But the return did not mean the end of government campaigns against Navajo identity. What followed across the next 100 years was a different kind of assault, one that targeted not bodies and land, but the language. and the children who carried it forward. The Indian boarding school system represents one of the most sustained cultural destruction campaigns in American history. Beginning in the 1870s and continuing, remarkably, all the way through the 1970s, the United States government funded and operated residential schools for indigenous children, whose explicit stated purpose was the elimination of indigenous cultural identity. The foundational philosophy was expressed openly by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who established the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879. His stated goal was to remove everything indigenous from the children who came through these institutions, leaving behind individuals indistinguishable from non-indigenous Americans. The United States government funded the implementation of this belief for a century. In practice, Navajo children as young as 4 or 5 were taken from their families and transported hundreds of miles away. At these schools, family names were replaced with English names. Hair was cut. Traditional clothing was taken away. And the language, always centrally the language which was forbidden. The prohibition was not theoretical. Testimony from survivors, collected across many oral history projects, is consistent in describing active physical punishment of children who spoke their native language. Children were struck with hands, rulers, and other implements for speaking Navajo. Some describe isolation, forced labor, methods of punishment causing physical pain. Some carry memories of deliberate shame, of being told repeatedly that the language they spoke was primitive, something to be embarrassed about rather than valued. What this amounted to across an entire century was a sustained effort to sever the connection between generations of Navajo people and the language connecting them to their history, their spiritual practice, and their identity. Parents who had survived boarding school themselves then watched their own children taken to the same kinds of institutions. The intergenerational damage to language transmission is part of why the Navajo language faces the preservation challenges it faces today. This is the world into which the men who became code talkers were born. This is the history they carried with them, and this is the context that makes what they chose to do so extraordinary. The year is 1941. America's distance from the war ended on December 7th, when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,403 Americans in a single morning. The United States entered the Second World War the following day. Almost immediately, the communications crisis military planners had been quietly managing became an urgent emergency. Every encryption system American forces were using was vulnerable. German code breakers were sophisticated and experienced. Japanese signals intelligence had demonstrated the ability to break American codes. Battle plans transmitted through supposedly secure channels were being intercepted and decoded. Supply convoys were ambushed along routes believed to be secret. Operations were anticipated before they could be executed. Soldiers were dying not because they were outfought, but because the information environment had been compromised. The United States invested heavily in developing better codes. Mechanical cipher machines of extraordinary complexity were designed and built. Mathematical systems requiring teams of trained specialists were developed. Each new system was eventually broken. The fundamental problem was structural. Every approach being developed remained within the same basic analytical framework, and given enough intercepted messages and skilled analysts, any such system was eventually breakable. What was needed was not a more complex version of the same approach, but something categorically different, something completely outside the framework. Then, Philip Johnston walked into a Marine Corps office in Los Angeles in early tour, 1942, with exactly that kind of idea. Johnston was 40 years old, a civil engineer with no military rank, no cryptography background, and no obvious qualification to walk into a Marine Corps planning office with ideas about communication security. What he had instead was a childhood unlike almost any other non-Native American of his generation. Johnston had grown up on the Navajo Nation. His father was a Protestant missionary who worked within Navajo communities, and Philip had been raised in close proximity to Navajo daily life, not as an outside observer, but as a child growing up alongside Navajo children, absorbing the rhythms and language of the community from early childhood. By adulthood, he was one of fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the world who could speak the language with genuine fluency. This gave Johnston a perspective no one in American military intelligence possessed. The Navajo language had no written form of any kind, no dictionary, no grammar textbook, no recordings available to researchers anywhere in the world. The only way to acquire meaningful knowledge of it was through years of personal immersion within the Navajo Nation itself, beginning in childhood. Beyond these practical barriers to enemy analysis, the language had structural characteristics, making it resistant to conventional code-breaking approaches. It was tonal, with pitch changes altering meaning in ways with no parallel in European or Japanese languages. Its grammatical structures encoded information in ways with no direct mapping to the analytical frameworks a European or Japanese analyst would apply. When Johnston demonstrated this by speaking Navajo aloud in that Marine Corps office, watching experienced officers encounter, for the first time, something they couldn't even identify as belonging to a known language family. The commanding officer authorized a pilot program. 29 Navajo men would be recruited, would develop a communication code using their language as its foundation, and the system would be tested. The quiet word spreading through the Navajo Nation in spring 1942 described something whose details couldn't be shared in advance. Fluency in both Navajo and English, physical fitness for Marine Corps service, willingness to volunteer for something unknown. The men who responded did so, knowing the full history of what the United States had done to their people. The long walk was living memory in their families. Many had parents or relatives who had attended boarding schools. They had grown up on reservations where broken government promises were not historical abstractions, but daily realities. And they came anyway. 29 young Navajo men arrived at Camp Pendleton in May 1942. Their task, as explained in their initial briefing, was unprecedented. Construct a complete military communication code using Navajo as its foundation, covering every situation likely to arise in Pacific combat. Military, terms for which Navajo had no vocabulary, had to be created, and the method of creation reflected the way Navajo people naturally understood and described the world. K-fighter aircraft, small, fast, capable of sudden decisive strikes, became the hummingbird. A tank, massive, armored, slow but devastating, became the turtle. A submarine operating hidden beneath the surface became the iron fish. America itself, the nation these men were preparing to defend, became Nehema, our mother. The weight of that choice of words increases the longer you think about it. The complete code covered hundreds of military terms, plus a letter-by-letter spelling system for words without code equivalents. The entire system had to be memorized completely. No written copies would exist in the field, because a captured code book would compromise everything. The code existed only in the minds of the men who had built and learned it. Testing was conducted by experienced military signals intelligence analysts, men whose professional background was in exactly the kind of code breaking that had damaged American communication security throughout the war. These analysts were given recordings, equipment, and unlimited time. They produced essentially nothing. They could not identify the language family. They could not apply their established techniques, because the foundational linguistic assumptions those techniques rested on simply didn't apply to what they were hearing. The code had passed. The code talkers were ready. August 1942, Guadalcanal, a jungle island in the Solomon Islands chain where the United States and Japan were fighting one of the most brutal and strategically significant campaigns of the Pacific War. The Japanese had been building an airfield whose completion would alter the balance of Pacific air power. American forces had to take it. Japanese forces had to hold it. 6 months of sustained, vicious combat followed in heat and terrain that tested everything American forces had. Into this environment came the first code talker deployment. Major Howard Connor, the signals officer responsible for communications, had arrived skeptical. Experience had taught him that new systems often failed under genuine field conditions. What he observed converted that skepticism into something approaching reverence. Under live fire, in jungle darkness, with the enemy sometimes close enough to hear breathing, code talkers transmitted complex tactical messages at the speed of speech. No machine, no codebook, No equipment that could jam or fail. Just two men, one transmitting, one receiving, faster and more accurate than any system Connor had ever seen. And to any intercepting Japanese analyst, completely incomprehensible. Japanese intelligence captured every transmission. Historical records from Japanese signals intelligence units describe persistent failure. Transmissions identified as American in origin, but encoded in something that resisted every analytical approach applied. No breakthrough ever came from Guadalcanal. Code talkers followed the arc of the Pacific campaign. Bougainville, Guam, Peleliu, Leyte, Luzon, island by island, battle by battle. Across 3 years of sustained combat, moving relentlessly toward Japan. In each campaign they served as combat marines first. Communicators always, facing the same dangers as every man around them. Unable even to discuss their specific contribution with the fellow Marines who most directly depended on it. And then came Iwo Jima, February 1945. 8 square miles of black volcanic rock, 700 miles from mainland Japan. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had spent months overseeing the construction of a defense unlike anything American forces had encountered, a network of tunnels and fortified positions 30 feet below the surface, honeycombing the entire island with interconnected underground passages immune to surface bombardment. Every beach pre-ranged with artillery, every approach planned for. His orders to his forces left no ambiguity. Fight to the last man. 70,000 Marines landed on February 19th. The volcanic sand, black, coarse, heavy, pulled at boots with every step. The Japanese waited until the beaches were crowded before opening fire. In the first hour, 2,400 Americans were killed or wounded. The battle lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 American Marines died. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 200 survived. Throughout every one of those 36 days, code talkers transmitted. Major Connor had 6 working continuously around him. In rotating shifts around the clock, they transmitted troop positions, casualty reports, artillery coordinates, air support requests, evacuation routes. Over 800 confirmed messages in 36 days. Everyone received accurately. Not one decoded by the enemy. Afterward, Connor said what has been quoted ever since. Were it not for the Navajo, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The war ended with Japan's formal surrender in September 1945. The celebrations that followed were genuine and enormous, years of fear and loss releasing in waves of relief across American communities everywhere. The code talkers came home, but the classification order remained in effect. Military planners had determined that the code's potential future value meant its existence had to stay secret.
The island is now just
the order
a
to say
dark
nothing
shape
held.
getting smaller.
Wives asked what they'd done in the war.
But what happened there?
They shook their heads. Parents asked. They said they couldn't talk about it. Children grew up watching their fathers sit quietly at gatherings while other veterans told stories, never understanding why their fathers never did. Some code talkers tried in carefully vague language to suggest they'd done something significant. They were met with skepticism. The broader American reality of the era made the idea of a decisive Navajo contribution to the military campaign seem implausible to many. They came home to reservations with inadequate infrastructure, where poverty was widespread, where the same government that had sent them to the most dangerous battles of the Pacific offered the same broken promises it always had. They could not claim the recognition that might have helped. They could not explain the service that deserved acknowledgement. They aged in quiet obscurity, while the history books they could see in libraries described in detail a Pacific campaign that contained no mention of them. The silence lasted 23 years. In 1968, the program was finally declassified. The strategic rationale for continued secrecy had faded as communications technology advanced. The order was lifted. Most code talkers were now in their 40s and 50s. Their children were grown. The years of silence couldn't be recovered. Slowly, over years and decades, the story reached a broader audience. Books appeared. Documentaries were made. The Navajo Nation held recognition ceremonies. The story spread through the gradual accumulation of accounts and interviews that built a more complete picture of what had happened in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945 official. Recognition from the United States. Government came only in 2001. 56 years after the war ended, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 Navajo Code talkers. The ceremony was held in the Capitol Rotunda. 5 of the original 29 were still alive to attend. 5 men, most of them now in their 80s, received their medals from the President of the United States. 24 had died in the years between the war's end and this ceremony, had served, kept the secret, returned to reservations with inadequate services, aged without public acknowledgement, and died before the country that deployed them got around to saying thank you. Chester Nez, who would become the last surviving member of the original 29, was present that day. He received his medal and would live another 13 years, dying in 2014 at the age of 93. When asked what he wanted people to understand about what he and the other code talkers had done, he said he hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it for his people and for the land that was Navajo before it was called America, and would be Navajo long after. The legacy of the code talkers extends in several directions, and none has a simple or entirely satisfying resolution. Recognition has improved significantly from the decades of complete silence. The Congressional Gold Medal ceremony was followed by Congressional Silver Medals for the hundreds of code talkers who served after the original 29. A museum exists. Monuments stand on the Navajo Nation. The story is taught in some schools now, which is substantially better than the situation that existed for most of the 20th century. But recognition and justice remain different things, and the gap between them is real. The Navajo Nation in 2026 continues to face poverty rates among the highest of any community in the United States. Access to clean drinking water remains inadequate for significant numbers of households. Healthcare infrastructure is insufficient for the population it serves. Housing conditions on portions of the reservation fail basic standards of adequacy. Land rights promised in federal treaties more than a century ago continue to be contested and inadequately honored. The Navajo language, the weapon that helped save countless lives, is classified as endangered. The century of boarding school policies that deliberately targeted its transmission across generations did lasting damage that decades of revitalization work have not fully repaired. But the language is alive. There are school programs where it is taught with genuine dedication. There are families where grandparents teach grandchildren the same words and prayers once beaten out of their own parents in government schools. There are young people who have chosen to learn it, not because anyone requires them to, but because they understand what it is, what it represents, and what would be lost if it disappeared. The resilience that kept the Navajo language alive through a century of deliberate assault is the same resilience that sent 29 young men to Camp Pendleton in 1942, knowing what America had done to their people and choosing to serve it anyway. Not because they had forgotten the history, not because the injustice didn't matter, but because something else mattered more, a love for their people, their land, and their language, and a determination that those things would survive regardless of personal cost. They came home and kept a secret for 23 years because they had given their word. They lived their quiet lives without public acknowledgement and without bitterness. And the ones who lived long enough to hold that gold medal in their hands received it with the dignity they had always carried. The dignity of people who know exactly who they are, regardless of whether anyone around them has been paying attention. That is the deepest lesson here. Not just the history of the code itself, remarkable as it is, but the demonstration, lived out daily across years of combat and decades of silence, that it is possible to hold injustice and service together in the same hands without letting either one erase the other. That it is possible to love what is worth loving in a place and a people, even when that place and those people have failed you profoundly. That the decision to protect what matters is not contingent on being treated fairly by those you are protecting. If this story reached something in you today, hit like right now. Subscribe. Because every week on this channel, we find the stories that were classified, minimized, or simply never told with the honesty and depth they deserve. Share this with someone, a veteran, a history lover, someone who thinks they already know the full story of World War II, Show them what hasn't been told. The people who went to their graves having served faithfully and been rewarded with silence and invisibility deserve to have their story reach as many people as possible. Even now, even decades after most of them are gone. Comment below one word. Just one word describing how you feel after hearing this story. I will read every single one. Until next time, walk in beauty, walk in honor, and never stop learning the stories that were meant to be forgotten, because those are always the ones that matter most. So let's bring this back to where we started, a people who had every reason to walk away, a government that had spent a century trying to erase their language, their land and their identity, and 29 young men who looked at all of that history, carried its full weight and still chose to serve, building an unbreakable code from the very language America had once tried to silence. That code helped win battles like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. It saved countless lives, and it was kept secret for 23 years, leaving these men to live quietly among us, unrecognized, while the country they protected slowly, far too slowly, learned the truth. That's the story of the Navajo Code talkers, a story of injustice and honor existing side by side. A story this country is still learning how to fully tell. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and for letting these men's story matter to you, even briefly, even decades later. That's exactly why this channel exists. If this video moved you, please hit like. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who deserve to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Every week we dig into the history, culture, and untold stories of Native American nations, the chapters that rarely make it into textbooks, but absolutely should. There's always more to uncover. If you want quicker bites of history between these longer videos, check out our shorts, fast, fascinating glimpses into Native American culture, traditions, and the kinds of facts that make you stop scrolling and think. And please share this with someone, a veteran, a history lover, anyone who believes the truth is worth knowing, no matter how long it took to come out. Until next time, remember that history isn't just what gets written down. Sometimes it's what gets carried in silence, waiting patiently for someone to finally listen.